Greenfield, Ohio, 1992. Jake Dowan's morning began, as it always had, with an early rise and a quiet routine. He sat at the worn kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee he had made for himself, a habit he had held on to for years. The familiar steam rose in the cool morning air, but there was nothing comforting about it now. It was just part of a pattern that no longer made sense. He had returned home after 4 years of service in the Army. His life in uniform felt like a distant memory, and now he was back in the town that had once been his entire world. But everything had changed, or perhaps it was only him who had changed. Greenfield was still the same, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the landscape hadn't altered, but the meaning of it all had shifted for him. The small house where he grew up no longer felt like home. It was old, creaking under the weight of years, and he could see the signs of time everywhere. The walls that once seemed full of warmth now looked cold and empty. His father's old tools still hung in the garage, unused and gathering dust, and his mother's floral curtains still hung by the windows, faded by the years. Yet none of it held the same comfort it once had. It was as though the life he had known was a memory too distant to touch. Walking through the streets of Greenfield, Jake felt like a ghost. His boots hit the cracked pavement, but the sound of his footsteps seemed foreign in a place that had always been familiar. The town appeared the same on the surface. Houses standing in neat rows, children playing in front yards, old shops lining the main street. But there was a distance now, a chasm between him and everything else. No one acknowledged his presence as he walked past. No friendly faces, no familiar waves. It was as though he had never left. He wasn't sure if that was comforting or unsettling. There were no greetings, no warm reunions with old friends or neighbors. It was as though the town had forgotten him, or perhaps it was just that he had changed so much that he no longer belonged. The street corners he had once walked with ease now felt like foreign territory. The faces that passed him by seemed to glance through him, as if they didn't recognize him anymore. It wasn't the usual indifference that he had grown used to. It was something deeper, a silent reminder that the man who had left was no longer the same person who had returned. The world around him moved on, unaffected by his presence, while he remained stuck in the past. The days seemed endless, filled with quiet moments of reflection, but there was no real peace to be found. Every corner of Greenfield was a reminder of the life he had left behind, the family he had lost touch with, and the experiences that had changed him beyond recognition. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the town had stayed frozen in time, while he had been shaped by things it could never understand. He had left as a boy and returned as something different, something that didn't quite fit into the picture of this small town. At night, when the streets grew quiet and the lights of the town dimmed, Jake would sit in his living room staring at the walls, listening to the silence that surrounded him. He had no real plans, no clear direction. He was back, but for what? The life he had known here seemed distant, a faded image he couldn't quite make out. The place hadn't changed, but he had, and somehow that made all the difference. Several days had passed, and Jake still didn't know what to do next. The quiet of the small town weighed heavily on him. The adjustment to civilian life was more challenging than he had anticipated, and he found himself lost in the rhythm of a world that felt distant. One morning he wandered into the local cafe, drawn by the familiar scent of brewed coffee and the hum of conversation. The cafe was a small, cozy place with an eclectic mix of regulars, and Jake had heard it was a spot where everyone in Greenfield eventually passed through. But for someone like him, a man who had returned from the chaos of war, it was a place that felt foreign. The routines of this world, people chatting about mundane topics, discussing politics, or commenting on the weather, were alien to him. Jake sat in a corner, away from the bustle of the cafe, and quietly observed the world around him. He didn't know what to do with himself in the silence between the chattering voices. He would drink his coffee slowly, watching the comings and goings of the townsfolk. The rhythm of life continued around him, but he was disconnected from it. He felt like an outsider, caught in a space between his past and present, unable to fully engage with the world he had returned to. The people in the cafe were polite enough, but they never reached out. They didn't know how to talk to someone like him, someone who had seen things they would never understand. Jake noticed the glances directed at him, the subtle way people looked away when their eyes met his. He knew what they saw, a man who had been shaped by the things he had done, the scars of his past visible on his face and in the way he carried himself. They didn't ask questions, they didn't want to. His war-torn face was a reminder of something they didn't want to confront, so they ignored it, choosing to remain in their comfortable, predictable lives. But one day as he sat there, he noticed an older man who had just entered the cafe. The man was seated at a table across the room, and Jake's eyes were drawn to him. There was something about the way the old man carried himself, the calm in his demeanor, that caught Jake's attention. The old man's face was marked by the passage of time, with deep wrinkles and scars that told a story of their own. But unlike Jake, this man seemed to accept his past, as though the marks on his face were not burdens, but badges of honor. Jake couldn't help but feel a strange pull towards the old man. There was something about the way he sat at the table, almost as if he had found peace with his past, that made Jake feel both envious and intrigued. This was a man who had clearly lived through his own battles, both on the outside and within. But he didn't seem to mind the attention his scars drew. His eyes, though aged, were steady and confident. He wore his history on his skin as if it had become part of him, something that no longer needed to be hidden or ignored. Jake continued to watch him from across the room, wondering what it must be like to reach a place where the past didn't control you, where the scars were not something to be ashamed of, but something to be accepted as part of who you were. The old man didn't seem to care that people occasionally glanced his way. He didn't hide his face or turn away when he felt someone's gaze lingering on him. He simply sat there drinking his coffee, as if the world around him had no power over him. Jake couldn't shake the thought that maybe this old man had figured something out, something Jake hadn't yet learned. He had accepted his past, his scars, his memories, while Jake was still struggling with his own. Every time he tried to look past the pain and the loss, it seemed to rear up again, reminding him of the things he couldn't escape. As the days went on, Jake continued to return to the cafe. He would sit in his usual spot, watching the people around him and listening to the background noise of their conversations, but his attention was often pulled to the old man, who seemed to come in regularly. There was an unspoken connection between them, a shared understanding that neither man had to voice. They both carried the weight of their experiences, but while Jake was still trying to find a way to make peace with his past, the old man had long since made his peace. The cafe became a strange sort of refuge for Jake. It wasn't that he found comfort in the small, tight-knit community around him. It was more that it gave him a place to observe life without having to participate in it fully. Each day he sat at the corner table, trying to make sense of his place in a world that seemed so far removed from the one he had left behind. The contrast between him and the old man was clear, and it gnawed at Jake. The old man had found his peace, and Jake was still searching for his own. Several days had passed since Jake's last visit to the cafe. He had returned, settling into his usual spot, quietly nursing his coffee. The cafe was buzzing as usual with the familiar sounds of small-town life, laughter, clinking of silverware, and the chatter of people catching up. But today something felt different. As he scanned the room, his attention was drawn to a group of young men sitting at a nearby table. Their laughter was loud and boisterous, their voices cutting through the quiet hum of the cafe. Jake could feel the shift in the air as the conversation turned to the old man, Harry, who sat alone at his usual table by the window. The young men were clearly enjoying themselves, mocking Harry in a way that felt too familiar to Jake. One of the young men, a lanky figure with a cocky grin, leaned back in his chair and loudly remarked, "What happened to your face?" The words were sharp, deliberately cruel, and they hung in the air like a weight. The insult wasn't subtle, it was direct and intended to embarrass Harry in front of everyone. Jake watched the old man's reaction, his heart tightening. Harry didn't flinch, didn't retaliate. He simply looked down at his coffee, the creases on his face deepening as he slowly stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. Without a word, he turned and began walking toward the exit, his movements slow but deliberate, as though he had long since grown accustomed to the sting of such insults. Jake's eyes followed Harry as he walked past the group of young men, ignoring them entirely. The mockers were too busy laughing amongst themselves to notice the pain that radiated from the old man's every step. But Jake saw it, the subtle, quiet sorrow in Harry's eyes. It was a sorrow that Jake knew all too well. He had seen it in the eyes of men he had served with, in the eyes of those who had borne the weight of war and loss. It was a pain that could never fully heal, a kind of deep-seated ache that stayed with you long after the battle had ended. Jake felt the urge to stand up, to do something, anything, to defend Harry, to stop the mockery, but his body remained frozen in place. His hands tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to act, to say something, but in that moment, the words seemed too distant, the courage too fleeting. He sat in his chair, paralyzed by the weight of his own inaction. Then, as if the tension in the room had reached a breaking point, a voice interrupted the buzz of laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, carrying with it the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. Jake turned his head and saw a man standing in the doorway. A tall figure in a military uniform, his posture ramrod straight. His face was stern, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the weight of his presence. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The young men at the table stopped talking, their eyes flicking nervously to the man who had entered. Even Harry, halfway to the door, paused for a brief moment. The man took a few deliberate steps toward the table where the young men were sitting. His eyes scanned the group, but it wasn't anger that flashed in his gaze. It was something far more dangerous, a quiet, contained authority that only those who had seen the brutality of war could possess. He was a man who had commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. As he reached the table, he stopped and looked down at the young men. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of years of experience, of countless battles fought and won, both on the battlefield and in the quiet moments of life. "Respect those who served, boys," he said simply, his words cutting through the awkward tension in the room. The 6 words hung in the air, charged with a power that seemed to freeze time itself. The young men stared at him, their smiles fading into embarrassed silence. The cafe, once filled with idle chatter, now seemed to hold its breath. The general's words had struck the room like a thunderclap, and for a brief moment there was no sound, no movement, only the lingering weight of those 6 words. Jake felt the change in the atmosphere, a shift he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the silence that had descended upon the cafe, but the collective realization of something deeper, the acknowledgement that they had witnessed something important, something that went beyond the usual daily routine. The young men at the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the general and each other, unsure of how to respond. But the general didn't wait for them to speak. With a final, steady look, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of people who were still processing what had just happened. Harry, who had stopped near the door, stood there for a moment longer before continuing on his way, his back slightly straighter than before. He didn't look at anyone, didn't acknowledge the general's intervention. But Jake could see it, the subtle change in him. It was as if, in that brief moment, something had shifted for Harry, as though the years of silent suffering had been recognized by someone who understood. Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The general's words had done something to him, something he hadn't expected. In that brief encounter, he had been reminded of what it meant to stand up for others, to show respect in the face of cruelty. He had been a passive observer for so long, watching from the sidelines as the world continued to move around him. But for the first time since he had returned home, he felt the stirrings of something more. A desire to no longer remain silent, to no longer let moments like this pass by without action. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew that something inside him had changed. He couldn't go back to simply watching anymore. He had to be part of the change. Chapter 4: Acknowledgement. Jake had not expected such a turn of events. The general, just like him, was a veteran. Though Jake did not know him personally, there was an instant, deep sense of gratitude he felt for the man. It wasn't just the action that had taken place, but the recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of something that had been missing from his life for a long time. In that moment, Jake realized that his return to this small town, his return to the world of civilians, might actually mean something after all. As the general stood beside Harry, The room fell into a hushed silence. The general moved with the kind of deliberate calm that came only with years of experience, of knowing when to act and when to let things unfold on their own. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small worn box. The metal of the box gleamed faintly in the dim light of the cafe as he carefully opened it. Inside was a medal, a token of honor that had witnessed more battles than any civilian could ever understand. Without a word, the general took the medal and placed it into Harry's weathered hands. The entire cafe watched, transfixed by the exchange. Harry looked down at the medal for a long moment. His hands trembled slightly, but he did not show any signs of emotion beyond the faint nod of his head. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of a long past that had shaped him into the man he had become. He didn't speak, didn't say anything that might betray the depth of the moment. Instead, he simply accepted the medal, holding it carefully in his palm as if it were not just a physical object, but a symbol of everything he had endured. The patrons of the cafe, who had once looked at Harry with a mixture of discomfort and avoidance, now found themselves looking at him with something different. It wasn't pity or forced sympathy, it was respect. People who had avoided eye contact with him now found themselves glancing his way, as if seeing him for the first time. The walls that had separated them from the pain of others seemed to crack open just a little. They began to understand that the scars Harry carried were not marks of shame, but of sacrifice, and that was a lesson Jake had learned long ago. As he watched the scene unfold before him, Jake felt something stir inside of him, a quiet realization. The things he had tried so hard to hide, the experiences he had bottled up inside, had never truly been his to keep alone. They were part of the larger story of the men and women who had served, part of the silent fabric that wove their lives together. And for the first time, Jake felt the weight of his own scars in a new light. The memories of the war, the ones that had haunted him for so long, no longer felt like a burden to bear in isolation. He looked around the room, his eyes resting on the people who had been part of this small community. They were looking at Harry differently now, and in doing so, they were also starting to look at themselves differently. No one had spoken aloud about the things that had been shared in that quiet exchange, but everyone understood. In that simple moment, a collective acknowledgement had taken place. It was as if the whole room had been waiting for this permission to see beyond the surface, to recognize the human cost of freedom. Jake's mind wandered back to his own time in service, to the days spent in places that felt like a world away. He had never sought recognition for his own sacrifices. He had always believed that the true measure of honor was in what was left unsaid. But as he watched Harry, and as he witnessed the general's quiet recognition, Jake realized that there was more to it than that. People needed to see the scars. They needed to understand the cost. They needed to know that there were stories hidden beneath the surface, stories of sacrifice and survival. The feeling inside Jake was subtle, yet undeniable. Something had shifted in him. Perhaps it was the weight of his own experiences, or perhaps it was the recognition of the shared history of those who had served. But whatever it was, Jake felt the stirring of a new purpose. The acknowledgement in the cafe had ignited something within him, something that had been dormant for far too long. He sat there in his corner, watching the room, watching how people's perceptions were beginning to change. The young men who had once mocked Harry now sat quietly, their eyes downcast, their once cocky attitudes replaced by a new awareness. The general's words had been simple, but they had carried an undeniable weight. In the wake of those words, the cafe was no longer just a place to grab a cup of coffee. It had become a space where recognition, however quiet, could take root. And as Jake thought about this, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of peace. It was as if, for the first time, he was no longer alone in his struggle. Weeks passed, and Jake found himself returning to the cafe more frequently. However, his visits had changed. He no longer sat in the corner, isolated from the world. Instead, he began to engage with other veterans who had found their way to the same quiet haven. The cafe, once a place of silent reflection, had transformed into a gathering spot for those who carried the same weight, the same scars, the same burdens. Each morning he would walk through the door, the familiar bell above the entrance signaling his arrival, and there would be someone waiting, someone who understood. The conversations were not about politics or the weather or the trivialities that filled the air at most cafes. They were conversations about experiences, about battles fought in distant lands, about the brothers and sisters they had left behind. Every story, every word shared, felt like a thread weaving them all together. It was in these moments that Jake found strength. Each veteran who walked into the cafe carried a unique story, but in many ways, their struggles were the same. There was a solidarity in that, a recognition of the pain that no one else could fully comprehend. Jake had never sought out friendship or companionship in the traditional sense. He had learned to keep people at a distance, to remain isolated in his own thoughts and memories. But something had changed in him over the past few weeks. Perhaps it was the shared understanding he now found with his fellow veterans. Or maybe it was the quiet support of the cafe's community. Whatever it was, he no longer felt the same heaviness on his chest. The walls he had built around himself began to crumble, slowly at first, then more rapidly as the days passed. Among the new faces was a young woman named Sarah. She had recently started working at the cafe, and over time she became a constant presence in Jake's life. At first their interactions were brief and polite. She would bring him his coffee, offer a smile, and carry on with her tasks. But slowly something began to shift. Sarah started to linger a little longer when she served Jake, offering him a few words of encouragement or simply asking how his day had been. There was an ease to her presence, a warmth that made Jake feel, for the first time in a long while, like someone cared. As the weeks went by, Sarah's curiosity grew. She wanted to know more about Jake's past, about the experiences that had shaped him into the man sitting before her each day. She never pushed, never asked questions that might feel too intrusive, but her interest was clear. Jake, for his part, remained guarded. He had spent years hiding from the truth, keeping the horrors of his past locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. But with Sarah, something began to change. He didn't feel the need to hide. Perhaps it was because she seemed to see him, not as a broken man, but as someone who had survived, someone worthy of understanding, not just pity. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow through the cafe's front window, Sarah sat down beside Jake. She wasn't working at the moment, and the cafe was quiet, the hum of conversation dimming in the background. For a long time they sat there in silence, the weight of their shared understanding lingering between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, not with words of sympathy, but with simple acknowledgement. She asked about the war, about his life before the cafe, but she didn't press for answers. She only wanted to hear his story, to know him for who he was, not for what had happened to him. Jake had never told anyone the full extent of his experiences, not even the other veterans in the cafe. But with Sarah, he felt a pull to share, to open up in ways he hadn't thought possible. He spoke slowly at first, as if testing the waters, but soon his words began to flow more freely. He told her of the battles, the losses, the moments of silence after the fighting had stopped, when it was just him and the memories of those who didn't make it out. He told her about the guilt, the fear, the constant weight of knowing that survival sometimes meant leaving others behind. Sarah listened without judgment. Her presence was calm, unassuming, and her attentiveness made Jake feel like his story mattered. In that moment, Jake realized that this small town, with all its quiet familiarity, was not just a place of forgotten memories. It was a place where new beginnings could take root. He had spent so many years running from his past, from the man he had become, but now, in this cafe, surrounded by those who understood, he felt like he could finally start moving forward. The days that followed were not without difficulty. Jake still struggled with his past, and the pain of what he had witnessed didn't simply vanish because of a few meaningful conversations. But there was a shift in him, a change that allowed him to breathe a little easier. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a place in this world, a place where people didn't just see his scars but saw him, the man who had fought for something bigger than himself. Sarah, too, found herself drawn to Jake in ways she hadn't expected. She had come to the cafe to work, to pay the bills, to fill her days. But now she found herself deeply invested in the lives of the people she served, particularly Jake. She admired his resilience, his strength in the face of a world that often failed to recognize the sacrifices of those who had served. She didn't know if anything would ever come of their connection, but she didn't need to. She simply wanted to be there for him, to offer him the same kindness he had shown her in the quiet moments they shared. In the weeks that followed, Jake and Sarah's connection deepened. He began to open up more, not just about his past, but about his hopes for the future. And while he still carried the weight of his memories, he no longer felt like he had to carry them alone. The cafe had become more than just a place to pass the time. It had become a sanctuary, a place where people came together not to forget, but to find understanding. For Jake, it was a new beginning, a chance to start again in a town that had once felt like a stranger to him. One evening, the cafe became the backdrop for a gathering that felt different from all the others. The mayor of Greenfield had organized a small ceremony to honor those who had served. It was a simple affair, but one with a quiet significance that would ripple through the town for years to come. People from all walks of life, young and old, veterans and civilians alike, filled the small space. Jake stood beside Harry, both of them sharing a silence that spoke volumes. It was a silence forged in the struggles of their past, one that had been interrupted by the deep respect that now surrounded them. The cafe, which had once been a place where Jake felt like a stranger, had become a symbol of something greater, a place of recognition, not just for the veterans who came there every day, but for everyone who had ever been touched by the silent weight of service. The mayor, with quiet reverence, spoke about the importance of acknowledging the sacrifices made by those who had fought. There were no grand speeches, no loud applause, only a shared understanding in the room. Jake, who had spent so long feeling invisible, found himself in the center of it all, not as a soldier, but as a man who had earned the respect of the people around him. Later that evening, a new plaque was mounted on the wall of the cafe. The engraving was simple, but it held immense meaning. Those who serve deserve our respect. It wasn't just a plaque. It was a recognition of a community's willingness to look beyond the surface and see the person, the story, the sacrifice. Jake stood there, his hands resting lightly at his sides, feeling something inside him stir. The recognition was not for his service alone, but for the years of silence and struggle that had led to this moment. It was an acknowledgement not just from the town, but from himself. For so long, Jake had walked through life feeling as though he was still serving on the front lines of his past, fighting battles that no one else could see. But now, as the words on the plaque settled into the quiet of the cafe, he understood that he was no longer fighting alone. The people around him had recognized not just the scars on his body, but the man beneath them. As the evening wore on, people came to Jake, some with words of gratitude, others with quiet nods of respect. It wasn't the fanfare that mattered. It was the sincerity in their eyes, the understanding that had grown between them over time. The veteran who had once walked into the cafe feeling like a ghost was now a part of something real, something tangible. His past, with all its pain and weight, had been transformed into a shared experience, one that had brought him closer to those who might never fully understand, but who were willing to see him for who he truly was. As the last of the guests filtered out of the cafe that evening, Jake lingered for a while, sitting at his usual spot by the window. The quiet of the night settled around him, but it felt different now. He no longer felt like an outsider in his own town. He had come home, not because the place had changed, but because he had. The man who had once feared being forgotten was now a part of a community that valued him, not for his past, but for the strength he had shown in embracing it. Jake looked at the plaque one last time before leaving. Those who serve deserve our respect. He knew that the respect he had earned here wasn't just given out of duty, it had been earned through time, through the simple act of showing up, of allowing others to see his humanity beyond the scars. He didn't need to speak. The recognition had been made, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace with it. He stepped out into the cool night, his footsteps steady on the pavement. The stars above shone bright, like silent witnesses to the journey he had made, the journey that was far from over. But for the first time, Jake didn't feel like he was walking it alone.